Sometimes a session, we don't discuss what we're doing.
Monday's Labor Day.
Oh, well, not like.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
More importantly,
As many as you want. They're not leaving the room with me.
Looks like we thinned out enough to fit in the seats at least, so that's an improvement. Yeah, I guess we can get started. I'll just check again, are there any questions from last time before we get into today's material? Okay, then I think we'll jump right into our first topic in looking at models for optimization, and that's modeling with respect to discrete optimization. Any of you who have had any sort of computer science training have probably encountered discrete optimization problems of various kinds already, and that's kind of why I included this topic, because I think it's helpful to get into modeling by thinking about it in terms of problems you already know how to solve. And if some of you already know how to solve some of these problems, I think it'll just help make this a bit easier to jump into the modeling issues that are really the focus of this class. Don't worry if you don't know how to solve these, we'll go over the ones you need to know, and if you need to know more, I'll point you to where you can learn more about this kind of material. I know many of you, especially in the CompBio Masters program, now Dr. Kingsford's algorithms classes requires. That's where you would learn quite a lot about this topic, but there are other places as well. Right, so the reason I bring this up is because when we're trying to model a real-world system, very often a good way to start is to take an informal description of the problem, which in real-world practice is usually all you get to start with, and ask if the problem you're trying to solve reminds you of something you already know how to solve. And in order for that to be a useful piece of advice, it helps if you know how to solve some things. So what I want to do is go through some of the common kinds of problems that we know how to solve. So some common sorts of discrete optimization problems. It's far from an exhaustive list. You'll learn many more in other classes. But I try to focus on a few that I think are representatives of problems that come up often in biological contexts, and especially ones that might look hard in the sense that if you don't know there's an algorithm out there, you might not realize there's a way of solving it efficiently. Now that is really just the first step of modeling, and towards the end of the class I want to get into what the next steps are beyond that, but I thought for now we can just start by looking at a few common classes of problems, and one of the simple versions of this is graph problems. So a graph in the computer science sense consists of two elements, a vertex set and an edge set, and we'll commonly represent vertices as circles or like that, and edges as lines connecting the circles. That would be an example of a graph. And graphs can come in a lot of different varieties. So we can have what is called a directed graph. So a directed graph means that if we've got two vertices, u and v, then an edge from u to v, which we'll commonly label u comma v, is a different thing than an edge from v to u, which we can label v comma u. And if you can have directed graphs, of course you can have undirected graphs. So in an undirected graph, we would say that if we've got two vertices u and v, then we simply have a single kind of edge, and the edge uv is the same thing as the edge vu. Another variation on graphs we'll commonly worry about is whether or not the graph is weighted or unweighted. So a weighted graph we will commonly denote by attaching a number to each edge in the graph, and a weighted graph could be directed or undirected. So you could have a graph where we've got an edge from u to v with weight 2, and an edge from v to u with weight tree. That might be an option for a weighted directed graph. And we'll commonly formally define the weight in terms of a weighting function, which you can call, let's say, W. So we would write that W is a mapping from the edge set to typically the real numbers, which we typically write with this fancy R. And in some cases, we'll use slightly different notation. We'll say that W is a mapping from vertices across vertices to real numbers. So that is more or less the same thing. They're not quite interchangeable. We'll often just use them interchangeably. And so any questions about that? Okay, so we can then take an example of a graph. So let's say we had the following graph. We'll have some V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. That would be our vertex set. We can make up some edge weights. And then what kind of graph would this be? Yeah, it's an undirected weighted graph. Right, so graphs come up a lot in almost any context where we're using computer science or algorithms, and biology contexts are no exceptions. So we've already in the previous class actually seen a couple of examples of graphs as representations in biology. Can anyone tell me where we saw those?
The protein folding?
Yeah, so the protein folding would be one example. There are actually a few different ways you can think of a graph occurring there. So one version of that is that if we have a particular configuration of a protein and we've defined sets of moves that tell us how you can change that configuration to produce various other ones, then you can get a graph of configurations of the protein. This is a piece of a kind of abstraction called the Markov model. That's one kind of graph that we would deal with, where our nodes are configurations or shapes of the protein, conformations, and our edges correspond to transitions between those or moves in the lattice model. Yeah?
Like tree or relationships.
Yeah, so evolutionary trees are another example. In an evolutionary tree, our nodes would typically be organisms, and then our edges would correspond to evolutionary relationships between those organisms. That would be another example. Can anyone tell me any other examples you can think of where we would encounter graphs in biology?
Metabolic networks, signal transduction.
Yeah, so metabolic networks would be an example. In a metabolic network, typically you would have some molecules. We might have some small molecules. So I'm going to try to make up a complete small molecule here, but let's say we've got something like this. And in a metabolic network, we might have a series of reactions that would catalyze changes in this molecule. So maybe this gets turned into an OH group or whatever, and maybe that's reversible, or enzymes annotating the edges. So that would be an example of a graph where our nodes would be metabolites or molecules. Our edges would typically correspond to reactions. A protein-protein interaction network is another example. So in a protein-protein interaction network, our nodes would be proteins, and our edges would correspond to interactions. So if two different proteins bind to one another, then we could say that protein A and protein B would correspond to nodes A and B in the graph, and then we could say that there is an undirected edge between them, implying that there is an interaction between A and B. And a signaling network would be an example of that. Another one would be a genetic regulatory network. Can anyone tell me what the nodes and edges might be in that? Is anyone familiar with genetic regulatory networks? Okay, well, that's a kind of network we commonly use to describe genetic regulation, so how genes regulate other genes. A node in that would typically be a gene, and then an edge would imply that one gene, let's say gene A, regulates gene B. And that would typically require a directed edge because it means something different to say gene A regulates gene B versus gene B regulates gene A. So that would be another example of this. And there are many more that we'll encounter over the course of this class, and that you'll probably be seeing beyond this class later in their careers. But basically that is the graph abstraction and why we care about it. And I want to then talk about some of the things we can do with graphs. So are there any questions about graphs before we get to graph problems? Okay, so let's start then with a simple example of a problem. And I'm going to take a problem that has some relevance to biology that is known as a minimum spanning tree problem. So a minimum spanning tree problem is one example of something we can compute on a graph. And to formally state it, we would say that we have an input to that problem. That input is going to be a weighted and normally undirected graph. And if it's weighted, that means the input is also going to need to include a weight function. So I'll use the notation, the weight function is a mapping from pairs of vertices to the real numbers. Okay. What else do we need for a formal specification of a problem?
Output.
Yeah, so we need an output. And for a minimum spanning tree problem, the output is going to be a tree. So a tree, let's call it G prime, and G prime is going to consist of V comma E prime, where E prime is a subset of E. So what does this mean? Yeah, so this is basically just saying that G prime is a tree that is embedded within the original graph. And what's the last thing we need for, oh, the question?
No, so you need the objective function.
Yeah, we need an objective function. And for the minimum spanning tree problem, the objective function is going to be the following. We want to minimize the sum over all of our edges UV in E prime of the weight of U comma V. So in other words, we're trying to find the tree embedded in our input graph that has lowest total weight summed over the edges of the tree. So if we take this example graph I had from before, we can pretty easily see what a minimum spanning tree would look like. In this case, the minimum spanning tree is going to look something like the following. So we're going to have weights 5, 3, 1, 2, 7. We're throwing out the weight 6 and the weight 3 edges here, and that is going to end up being a minimum spanning tree for this particular graph. So is the definition clear to everyone? Okay, so for the most part today, I'm not going to go into details about the algorithms. It's important for us to understand that there are algorithms for the problems I'm talking about, but for the most part, I think you guys can look these up and you should be able to follow the description of the algorithm for any problem you need to look at. But in this case, it'll actually be relevant later that we get into the details of a particular algorithm here. So we'll be going through it somewhat what the actual algorithm is for computing this. Now, there are actually a couple of classic algorithms for computing minimum spanning trees. Is anyone familiar with those?
Yeah, I forget the actual name of it, but it's just the basic 3D algorithm where you just take minimum weight edges, and if the two nodes aren't already connected, then you put it into your spanning tree.
Yeah, so what you're describing is called Kruskal's algorithm. That's one of the standard algorithms, and I'll go through that in a second. And the alternative is called Prim's algorithm. So Prim's is also a greedy algorithm. It works by a slightly different method, but they're both efficient ways of figuring out the minimum spanning tree for any arbitrary graph. Now, to walk through how this would work, let me just show you Kruskal's algorithm, and then I'll go through what pseudocode would look like formally describing that. So with Kruskal's algorithm, what we're first going to do is take our graph and create a set for each node in the graph. So we're just going to declare that there's a set that contains only node V3, a set that contains node V1, a set that contains V2, and so forth, one for each node in the graph. And then the algorithm is going to say we keep joining sets such that at each step we join the two distinct sets that are connected by the lowest weight edge. So in other words, if we look at this graph here, the lowest weight edge connecting two different sets is this edge between the set of node V2 and the set of node V4, which has weight 1. So the first step in Kruskal's algorithm would be to take our starting graph and then say, this is a set, this is a set, this is a set, this is a set, and now we have a set that contains those two nodes. We would then look at what's left here and ask what is the lowest weight edge connecting two sets in this graph now. What would the weight of that edge be? You have 2. All right, so we can then take the graph, say, now this is a set, this is a set, this is a set, and we're going to join along this weight 2 edge here so that now all 3 of these nodes are in a set. We can then keep continuing this process. At this point, we've got one set of these 3 nodes. We've got these 2 individually and these 2. The weights for connecting these 2 would be 5. For connecting this to this is 3. This to this is 6. This to this is 7. So the lowest weight one would be 3. And in the next step, what we're going to do is join together now these nodes. And we've got just 2 single node sets sitting off by themselves, and then we would next join in this node, and finally join in the last node. And we just keep track of which edge we are using to join them together as we go. It's going to end up that we used this edge here, and then we add in this edge, and then we add in this edge, and finally this edge. And we end up with our minimum spanning tree. So that is Kruskal's algorithm. So is the process clear to everyone? Now when we're talking about algorithms, usually just as with our statements of problems, we want to be a bit more formal. And the way we'll generally represent that is by describing algorithms when we talk about them in pseudocode. So pseudocode, for anyone not familiar with the term, is a kind of abstract sort of programming language. It isn't generally precisely specified. It just means to try to formalize enough that it would be obvious to anyone who understands basic computer science what algorithm is being used there. And sometimes there's some ambiguity in how that's defined. But I'll try to write some pseudocode for Kruskal's algorithm here to give those of you who are not so familiar with that an idea of the right level of abstraction here. So for Kruskal's algorithm, we might say that we are trying to create our edge sets. Let's call that E prime. And we're going to initially define that to be the empty set. So initially, we have no edges in the new edge set we're trying to create. And then what we're going to say is, for each of our vertices in the vertex set, so we've got a vertex set capital V, so this means for each little v vertex in capital V, we're going to define one of those sets. Let's call that S sub little v, which is initially just the set of little v. And we're also going to define a set label for little v, which is defined to be the set S sub v. So this is just a way of saying that each node gets a set, and then that node knows that the set containing it is its set. And we'll see shortly why that's needed. The next thing we're going to do is sort the edges. So E1 through, let's say, EM by their weights. And this is one of those places where I say there's a bit of ambiguity in what we mean by the right level of abstraction. For pseudocode, in some context, you might want to define exactly how you're sorting it, give the algorithm for that. For now, I'm just going to say there are n log n algorithms for sorting. Use one of those, and that's fine here. And once we've done that, what we're going to do is go through in sorted order. For each edge, E equals U comma V in E1 through E. Of the left endpoint, S of U, is not the same as the set of the right endpoint, S of V. Then we are going to, first of all, merge those sets. Say SV gets U, union, S of B. So that means join together the two sets to create a set of all of the nodes in those. S of U gets S of B, so now this union set is defined as the set of both of those nodes. And finally, we're going to say that E prime gets E prime union E. So we're going to say that we throw in that edge, those connecting U and B, to our edge set E prime. And when we're done with this, what we'll end up with is the tree that defines our minimum spanning tree. So is everyone clear on the notation here?
So the left arrow means like A is defined as something.
So yeah, left arrow would mean assignment. So left arrow means that this thing on the left becomes the thing that is on the right. So that becomes the value of this thing. Any other questions? Okay, so the pseudocode is in the text, and I changed the notation a little, but basically it's in the text. And most of the algorithms I'm talking about today are in the text, but I'm not going to go through the pseudocode for most of them in class. Just be aware that that's the sort of thing I mean if I ask you to write pseudocode on your homework assignments, for example. And in general, that's roughly the level of abstraction we would expect in the pseudocode. And any questions about any of that? Okay, so as I mentioned, there is an alternative algorithm, Prim's algorithm. I'm not going to go through how Prim's algorithm works. Sometimes Prim's algorithm can be more efficient depending on how dense your input graph is, that is how many edges it has. But in general, unless you're looking at really big problems, it's not really that important which of those you use, at least for the purposes of solving the MST problem. We'll see a bit later that it can be important which algorithm we use in a modeling context, because often we are using an algorithm like this as a starting point and trying to modify it to solve a slightly different problem, and then sometimes it will make a big difference which algorithm we start with. Okay, but anyway, that's one example of a graph problem. There's another set of problems that are collectively called shortest path problems. And I'll go through a few examples of those. The simplest version of a shortest path problem is something called a single pair shortest path. And a single pair shortest path is defined as follows. Our input is a graph P equals E comma E. It actually doesn't matter in this case whether it's directed or undirected. In the minimum spanning tree context, it does matter. You can actually solve it either way, but the algorithms are more complicated if it's directed, but here it really doesn't matter. We do need a weight function for this usually. That's going to be, say, a mapping from the edge set to the real numbers. And we need two specific vertices, S and T in the vertex set. And canonically, we refer to S as the source and T as the sink. Our output then will be a path and it's going to be a path of the form S, B1, 2, etc., up through BK, through T. So basically a sequence of nodes starting with the source, ending with the sink, and these others can be in any arbitrary order, such that S comma B1 is in our edge set, and BI comma BI plus 1 is in the edge set, and BK comma T is in the edge set. So in other words, every step along this path is in the edge set, or more or less it means what you would commonly expect a path through the graph to mean. You can walk through the entire set of nodes on the path using edges in the graph. And then our objective is kind of implied by the name of the problem. We're looking for a shortest path here, so what we're trying to do is minimize the weight of the edges on the path. So the weight from S to B1 plus sum I equals 1 to K minus 1, weight of BI plus 1, plus the weight of the edge from VK to T. So minimize that, or in other words, minimize the sum of weights of edges on the path. And that then would be the definition of a single source shortest path. And if we take the same example graph we had from before, and just arbitrarily label, let's say this vertex S and this vertex T, take the edge weights we had from before, so 5, 6, 3, 1, 2, 3, 7, then we can define a shortest path through the graph, and it's going to end up being the path that goes from S to here, that adds weight 3, from here to here, adding weight 2, here to here, adding weight 7, and in other words, we get a path of total cost 12 from S to T. So is that clear to everyone? All right, so this is a problem that you actually usually solve by solving a slightly harder version of the problem. So I'll just introduce the harder version now. And the harder version is what's known as a single source shortest path problem. So in a single source shortest path, we're basically doing the same thing, except instead of giving as input both a source and a sink, we give only a source, and we find the shortest path to every sink in the graph. So the shortest path from S to V for every V in the vertex set. And it turns out that in the worst case, at least, it's just as easy or just as hard to find the single source shortest path as it is to find a single pair shortest path. Right, so just as with the minimum spanning tree, there are a couple of classic algorithms for this problem. So there's one called Dijkstra's algorithm. There's another algorithm that's slightly more general. It's known as the Bellman-Ford algorithm. But again, I'm not going to dwell on the details of these algorithms. Dijkstra's algorithm works very similar to the Prim's algorithm for minimum spanning tree. It's a greedy algorithm where you basically grow a shortest path from one node outward. So you kind of start at your source node, and then you find the shortest path to a node you haven't reached yet that you can get to from there, and you just keep kind of growing outward from there until you've figured out the shortest path to every node in the graph. So that is more or less how we would solve a single source shortest path problem. So this is something we can solve efficiently, and these problems may have less obvious biological relevance or not so obvious biological relevance, but they actually come up in quite a lot of contexts in which we're trying to analyze questions like reachability in a graph. So an example of this might be if we are looking at one of these protein-protein interaction networks, and maybe we're not sure which proteins interact with one another. That's something we could represent as a graph where we might say we've got sets of proteins, we've got edges between them that define which ones might interact, and we can attach weights to those edges to represent a confidence of interaction. So typically you'd represent that as a minus log probability. You can think about why it would be minus log, but if you represent it that way, if you're trying to figure out the most likely way that this protein could produce an effect in this one, then you can think of that in terms of a shortest path problem. So finding the most likely chain of interactions by solving the shortest path through the graph between those nodes. So that is an example of the kind of place these would come up. There is also what's called the single destination shortest path. And a single destination shortest path consists of solving the shortest path problem where you're given t but not s, and you try to find the shortest path from every s to t. Can anyone think of how we could solve that problem?
The same as a single source, but flip all the directions, the edges.
Yeah, if you just flip the edges, it becomes a single source problem. So I told you we know how to solve single source, so we know how to solve single destination. There is also what's called the all pairs shortest path. And all pairs shortest path is the problem of finding the shortest path between any pair of vertices, considering all pairs of vertices in the graph. Now we can solve the all pairs shortest path by just solving the single source shortest path multiple times. So if we have n nodes, you can solve n single source shortest path problems and get a solution to the all pairs shortest path. But there are more efficient algorithms for this. So in general, you can solve the all pairs shortest path faster than you could solve many single source shortest paths. All right, so any questions about that? Okay, so another kind of problem we often deal with, and we'll see both today and next week quite a few versions of very similar problems to this, is a broad set of problems known as flow and cut problems. So in particular, I'm going to start by looking at what is called the max flow problem. This one's a little more complicated to describe than some of the other problems we've seen. In a max flow problem, we're going to assume that our input is a weighted directed graph. And if it's weighted, we're going to need a weight function. And in a flow problem, we commonly refer to the weight function as a specific thing called a capacity. So that would be a mapping from edges to real numbers. We'll denote that by C. That is the capacity function. And just as in the shortest path problems, we're going to define a source node and a sink node from the vertex set. So that would then be the input to the problem. And the output we're going to be looking for is also a function from the edge set to the real numbers, a particular kind of function called a flow function. And the flow function has to satisfy certain properties. So it's a function such that it satisfies the following. First of all, for any vertex, and again, this may be notation some of you haven't seen before, the upside down A means for all. So for all vertices in the set of V minus S and T. So any vertex other than the source and sink, we satisfy the following property. The sum over U comma V in the edge set of F of U comma V is equal to the sum over V comma U in the edge set of F of V comma U. So in other words, what this is saying is, if we pick any node V in the graph, and we look at the edges coming into V and the edges going out of V, then the sum of the flows on edges into V has to be equal to the sum of flows of edges out of V. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so the second property we need is that the flow from U to S is 0 for all U. So in other words, there's no flow going into the source. The flow from T to U is equal to 0 for all U in V. So there's no flow coming out of the sink. And then finally, F of UV is less than or equal to C of UV for all UV in E. So the capacity is the upper limit on the flow on any particular edge. So these properties together define a flow, and you can kind of think of this intuitively in terms of some matter or energy or whatever that we're trying to push through a network. So if you think of this as, let's say, a metabolic network, or let's say a metabolic transportation network, we're talking about moving some molecule between different tissues in an organism, then you can think of the capacity being the maximum rate or maximum throughput with which you can move things between those tissues, and then the flow would define a net rate of movement between some starting point, the source, and some ending point, the sink. So then these different properties here kind of define the natural sort of conditions that you have conservation at any internal node, and then that the object we're keeping track of is only fed in at one point and then removed at another point. All right, so the final thing we're going to need then is an objective. And the objective we're talking about in a flow problem, particularly a max flow problem, is to maximize the flow. And that's generally defined by saying that we're going to maximize the sum of the flow out of the source. So let's say the sum of S comma U over S comma U in E of F of S comma U. This will be the same as the sum of flow going into the sink because of the conservation, but this is just one way of defining how much flow we have in net in the graph. And we're trying to maximize that. All right, any questions about the definition here? Okay, so the algorithms for this get a little more complicated. Again, I'm not going to go through pseudocode or the details here. I mention this in part because these flow problems also come up quite a bit in understanding issues in biology as well as in models from many other kinds of contexts. They're very useful for understanding these kinds of transport or metabolic network processes where we're trying to keep track of transportation or something similar, but they have many other less obvious uses. And I mention them in part because this is a kind of problem where if you don't know there's an algorithm, it's not a trivial thing to figure out that there's an efficient way of solving this. It's not something you're likely to come up with a good algorithm for on your own, so it's good to know that there is an algorithm there. It's not actually that complicated to develop a working algorithm for this, an efficient one. And the usual way this works is to use what's called an augmenting path algorithm, which basically means you take your graph, you take your source and sink, and you ask, is there any path in the graph that lets you get from the source to the sink that has some excess capacity over each edge of the path? And if you find that, you just add flow to that path up to the minimum capacity amount you have left, and then just repeat that until you can't do it anymore. That's going to give you a solution. So can anyone figure out how we could find a path that has capacity left in it in the graph? Let's say we have some flow attached to the edges and we know the capacities on those edges. How could we figure out if there's a path with excess capacity?
If the minimum path in that path, minimum edge on that path is not being used up to its full capacity, then we can push more flow along that path.
Yeah, so typically what you would do is you would go through all of the edges, figure out for each edge, is there any excess? And then once you figure that out, you can run, let's say, a single source shortest path algorithm to find the shortest path that has capacity on all of the edges. All right, so that's more or less how these kinds of things work. And that is closely related to another problem called the min-cut problem. So the min-cut problem has the same input. So we've got a graph equals B comma E. We've got a capacity. And we've got a source and sink. And in the min-cut problem, our output is a little different. Our output is what's called a cut, which is a subset of the edge set such that it separates any path from S to T. So such that any path S to B, let's call it B1, etc., to BK to T contains some BI So in other words, we think of this as a cut. We call it a cut because if you cut out all of the edges on the cut, you separate the graph. You no longer have a way to get from S to T. So in our example graph, we could say that if we just directed the edges here, so let's put directions on these, we called that S, we called that T, then one example of a cut would be these two edges here. If you cut out those two edges, that would separate the graph. And it happens that for the weights we had been using earlier, that would be a minimum weight cut in the graph. So does the problem definition make sense? I guess I should say that we have to define the objective here, and since this is a minimum cut, the objective is going to be to minimize the sum over edges in E prime of the capacities of the edges. We want a cut of minimum weight. Is that clear to everyone? All right, so what's maybe not obvious is that these are actually two ways of looking at more or less the same problem, and that you can solve the minimum cut problem by solving the max flow problem. So in particular, the cost of the minimum cut is always going to be the same as the cost of the maximum flow. And it's kind of easy to see why that follows in one direction. So if you have a minimum cut, it's impossible there can be a maximum flow of higher cost than that, because the minimum cut is, in a sense, the tightest bottleneck on the flow. If pulling out edges of weight 5 is sufficient to cut the graph, then there's no way you could be pushing flow of greater than 5 through the graph. The opposite direction is not quite so obvious, but it also follows. So if you know the cost of the minimum cut, then that's also going to guarantee you that there isn't a maximum flow of higher value, or vice versa, because if there were a cheaper minimum cut somewhere else in the graph, then that would put a tighter limit on the flow in the graph. So that's not a rigorous proof, but that's more or less the intuition behind why the max flow is the same as the minimum cut. All right, so we'll be revisiting flow and cut problems, primarily cut problems, in the next lecture when we look at hard problems. But for today, we're talking about easy problems or tractable problems, and minimum cut is a good example of a tractable problem. All right, so any questions about that? All right, so one other example of a class of graph problems I wanted to go through is a set of related problems known as matching problems. In particular, I'll start with what's called maximum matching. And this actually comes in a few different flavors. But to know what maximum matching is, we need to know what a matching is. And a matching is relatively easy to illustrate. So if we take a sample graph here, then a matching is a subset of the edges of the graph that has the property that no two edges in the matching share any vertices. So in other words, if we start with this graph, I can take this edge, and that edge would be a matching in the graph. So just this one edge, because there's one edge, it has to be a matching. We can throw in another edge here, and this set of two edges is also a matching. So they don't share any vertices. We can throw in another edge, and that is also giving us a matching. So these three don't share any vertices. At this point, we have what's called a maximal matching, which is not the same thing as maximum matching. So maximal matching means there's no way to throw in another edge without it sharing an endpoint with one of these three edges. So this then would be the largest matching we can do of, well, without removing edges. Any questions about that? All right, so we can more formally say that if we are given a matching, our problem would have an input, which would be a graph v comma e, g equals v comma e. in most general case, this can be a weighted graph, so we could assume there's a weight function. I'll say a bit more about that later. This is one case where there are a number of variants, and depending on what we assume, we would generally use different sorts of algorithms. Our output is going to be the matching E prime subset of our edge set. And just to more formally say what I was saying before, it's an E prime subset V such that there does not exist any UVW in V, so any 3 vertices in the vertex set, such that UV is in E prime and UW is in E prime. So we can't find any 3 vertices such that 2 edges share a vertex from that set. And then for a maximum matching, what we're doing is simply saying we want to maximize the sum over edges in E prime of the weight of the edges. So we want a matching of maximum weight. Is that clear to everyone? Okay, so in a maximum matching, we often care quite a bit about how exactly we're defining the problem and what limits we put on the input to the problem. So the simplest version of a matching, we would actually have an unweighted graph. And even more than that, we would have an unweighted, what's called bipartite graph. And bipartite simply means that we have 2 sets of vertices. Let's call this V1 and V2, such that all of the edges in the graph are between a vertex in V1 and a vertex in V2. So that would be an example of a bipartite graph. And maximum matching in an unweighted bipartite graph is a very easy problem to solve. You can actually turn this into a max flow problem by just throwing an extra edge in there, putting a bunch of, or an extra node, putting a bunch of weight 1 edges here, weight 1 edges here, find a maximum flow in that graph, and that's going to give you the maximum matching. But usually we would want to move to somewhat more complicated problems. Where it starts to get interesting is when we have a weighted bipartite matching. And that has more complicated algorithms I'm not going to go into, but basically just be aware that that is also an efficiently solvable problem. So if we attached weights to these edges, you can still solve the problem. You can still find the maximum matching in that bipartite graph, but it's a slower algorithm. Now this problem I mentioned in part because it shows up in kind of disguised forms quite a bit in statistical physics contexts. So many kinds of energy minimization problems can be posed in terms of maximum matching. So just be aware that that's something you can solve, and often it comes up in the bipartite case. It actually is solvable even in the general case, so weighted general graphs. But the algorithms get very complicated for those cases, so that's something where you probably wouldn't want to implement your own algorithm. You want to look up a library that has a general weighted maximum matching algorithm. But again, be aware that this is something you can solve. Any questions about any of that? All right, so that's just a few graph problems. It's far from an exhaustive list, but I want to make sure there are some that all of us are aware of here, because when we get into actually looking at how we think about modeling, I want you guys to be able to go through some of these examples of problems and think about which ones might be appropriate for other kinds of systems. If you're really doing this for a living, you would want to be aware of many other problems, so at least take a real pure algorithms class and be aware of many other things you can solve. And the more of these problems you're aware of, the better equipped you'll be to look at real-world problems and find these kinds of relationships where you can think of something being posed as a maximum matching problem or a max, well, whatever. And so another general class of problems I wanted to talk about that's quite important in biology contexts are what are called string and sequence problems. So, of course, strings and sequences come up quite a lot in biology. We generally represent DNA as strings, amino acid sequences as strings, RNA, and so forth. So you will often be seeing algorithms for strings and sequences. And the distinction between string and sequence is not really, only matters when you're talking about substrings or superstrings or subsequences or supersequences. So I'll get to that in a moment when we start looking at the real problems. But just this is another general class where it's worth being aware of the existence of algorithms. And I'll point out here that this is a case where we often don't quite use the normal definitions of tractable versus intractable problems that you might see in other computer science contexts. So people who talk about algorithms very often worry about whether a problem is tractable, and usually what they mean by that is that there's an algorithm that runs in time that is polynomial in the size of the input. In biology context, usually that's not a good definition or not a good enough definition when we're talking about string problems, because something that runs in time quadratic in the length of your strings is not going to be okay if you're looking at a terabase of DNA sequence. You can't run something that is quadratic in 10 to the 12th, I guess 10 to the 12th bases of DNA or whatever. So very often when we're talking about string problems, tractable really means linear time or sometimes sublinear time. So just be aware that when I'm talking about these problems, the problems I'll be talking about here for the most part are things where you can probably pretty easily come up with a quadratic or maybe cubic algorithm, but there are some non-obvious algorithms that may be much faster for these problems. So one example is something called the longest common subsequence problem. And the longest common subsequence problem is stated as follows. Our input is going to be two ordered sets or sequences, S and T, let's call them. So might be that S is, let's say, the string ABC, 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 and T maybe is the string CA, BB, CC, BB. And our output is going to be a subsequence. U of S and T. And what it means to be a subsequence is that it is a selection of characters in order but not necessarily consecutive in the starting sequence. So ABC is a subsequence of S, but AAA is also a subsequence of S. And that's where I draw the distinction between a sequence and a string. So in a string, when we talk about a substring, that's assuming they're both in order and consecutive. So ABC is also a substring of S, but AAA is not a substring of S because the A's aren't consecutive. So is that distinction clear to everyone? Okay, so that then is our output, and our objective function is simply to maximize the length of U, which I'll denote this way. So in this case, we can kind of see an example of what might be the longest common subsequence by lining these up in a particular way. So let's say we've got A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, and then we'll line this up below them, C, A, B, B, C, C, B, B, and then we can observe that there are some regions of agreement that tell us that AB, BC, B is a subsequence of both of these. In this case, it happens to be the longest common subsequence. So is this problem clear to everyone? Right, so this is a problem for which there is a quadratic algorithm. So there's an algorithm whose runtime is proportional to the product of the lengths of the two sequences. And it works by a technique some of you may be familiar with called dynamic programming. So how many of you, just by show of hands, are familiar with dynamic programming? Okay, so not everyone, but a good fraction. So dynamic programming, I'm not going to go through exactly how that works here, but the general idea is that we can solve the problem by recognizing that if we know how to solve subproblems of it, we can solve slightly harder subproblems. And that's commonly represented in terms of what's called a recurrence function, where we basically say, let's suppose we can solve the longest common subsequence for the first I bases of sequence S and the first J of sequence T. We can figure out how to solve that if we can solve easier problems. And in particular, that's going to be either the maximum of the longest common subsequence for the first I-1 and J-1 bases plus one additional base, or longest common subsequence for I-1 and J, or the longest common subsequence for I, J-1. And this case applies if S sub I equals T sub J. So in other words, what this is saying is if the ith and jth bases agree, then you can construct a new solution by either taking the best alignment of everything except those bases and lining up those two bases, or by taking the best alignment of all but the jth base of T with the preceding bases of S, or vice versa. And in the other case, we would simply say it's the maximum of LCS I-1, J-1, LCS I-1, J, LCS I, J-1, in the case that SI doesn't equal TJ. Don't worry if you haven't seen this before. I'm sure you will be seeing this in other classes. If you've taken an algorithms class or you're taking one, you'll see dynamic programming, I'm sure there. Many of you are taking Dr. Duran's class. I'm pretty sure you will be seeing dynamic programming there. But basically, just be aware this is solvable by this technique. And if you're not familiar with the technique, don't worry about it for now. I mention this problem in part because it's a simplified model of a very important problem in biology. So can anyone tell me what problem in biology is related to this one? Yeah, so this is very closely related to sequence alignment. Effectively, it's a special case of the sequence alignment problem, and in particular, the special case where we have a gap cost of 0 and a mismatch penalty of infinity. So if you take sequence alignment and you say that it costs an infinite amount to line up two characters that don't agree, and it costs nothing to introduce gaps between characters, it turns into this problem. And I mention that because very often that's going to be the way we actually go about solving a biological problem. You start by reasoning about how it might remind you of the longest common subsequence problem, and then you figure out how you would kind of adapt your objective function, or adapt your recurrence relation to turn it into the problem you're really trying to solve. Another problem that is kind of obviously polynomial time solvable, but not obviously efficiently enough solvable, is a very similar sounding problem called the longest common substring problem. And if you understood the distinction between a substring and a subsequence, it should be obvious what that problem is. It's basically the same statement as this, except we're referring to a substring rather than a subsequence. So if we take the same S and T we had before, we can say that if we line them up in the following way, again notice that the longest piece of agreement is this set of sequence. You can't get anything longer than that. So again, the only distinction from the subsequence is that the substring has to be consecutive characters. So we see that CAB occurs in S, and CAB occurs in T, and so that's a substring. Is that clear to everyone? Right, so the longest common substring problem has a very obvious quadratic algorithm. Can anyone tell me how you could solve this in quadratic time?
Well, you do the longest common subsequence once for every offset few line strings.
Yeah, you can just slide one string against the other and then just kind of scan through and look for the longest agreement. So that would give you a quadratic algorithm. But this is one of those cases where sometimes we want to solve this for much larger sorts of strings than we might be able to solve in quadratic time. So this will end up being related to some real-world problems in which we might be interested in finding substrings in genomic-sized pieces of DNA, for example. And so you need something faster. And this is one of those cases where, again, I'm not going to go into details about how the algorithms work because they get very complicated. But I want you to be aware that there is actually a way of solving this in linear time. So in time proportional to the sum of the lengths of the two strings rather than the product of their lengths. And this has actually gone through quite a bit of revision in terms of how people do this. A few years ago, when I first started teaching this, I would talk about this in terms of a data structure called a suffix array. And even then, I would basically just describe what a suffix array is and not how to create one, because it would take at least a lecture to tell you how to create a suffix array. But basically, the important thing about it is it's a data structure that lets you take a sequence like this and in linear time put it into the suffix array. And using the suffix array, you can then do in linear time queries of the existence of any given subsequence or substring, string, not sequence, in the input string that you give it. And basically that gives you a way of feeding in one string and then testing for existence of substrings in the other to find the longest one present. So again, I'm not giving you the details here, just be aware this is solvable. Within the computational biology literature, this has gone through quite a bit of revision. So this was originally solved, people would use what's called a suffix tree, then they switched to suffix arrays, and then they started using something called the Burroughs-Wheeler transform. Now everyone is talking about FM indexes. If you read computational biology literature, they're all kind of versions of the same idea, but just be aware that this is something you can do. You can solve this problem in linear time. And I think if anyone really wants to know, Dr. Kingsford's string algorithms class is probably the place to go if you actually want to know how to solve these and build these data structures. So any questions about any of that? Okay, so I'll just mention that one other problem that's solved by very similar kinds of things, it's not strictly an optimization problem, but I'd like to mention in the same context, because you use the same kinds of techniques, is something called exact set matching. And exact set matching is a problem in which we're given as input a set of strings. So we've got one string, T, commonly referred to as the text, and a set of other strings, S1 through Sm. And normally we would assume that T is a very big string and S1 through Sm are shorter strings. And our output is going to be simply locations of each Si in T. So the problem, as I say, is not really an optimization. It's simply the problem of finding anywhere where any of the S's occur within T. So can anyone think of what that might have to do with biology? Why might we want to do that?
If you're going to align fragments in the genome.
Yeah, looking for alignments of sequencing fragments against the genome would be one example. We might have a lot of fragments. We're trying to line them up against the genome to maybe measure expression levels of genes from an RNA-seq experiment. And it comes up in lots of other contexts. If you are trying to find restriction sites for restriction enzymes in your genome, this would be a problem you're trying to solve there. If you're trying to find transcription factor binding sites or whatever. This is another problem where it's very obvious how to solve this in time proportional to t times, the length of t times the sum of the lengths of the SIs, so quadratic algorithm. Not so obvious that you can solve it in time t plus the lengths of the SIs, but that is doable by the same kinds of data structures. And if you're talking about a big sequence, let's say T is a genome and the S is maybe a library of sequence fragments, it can make a very big difference whether you're talking about this or this. So any questions about any of that? Okay, so again, this is far from an exhaustive set of problems, but I think it's a good set for us to start with, so we have some common problems we can talk about when we discuss how to use problems we know how to solve in our modeling context. And again, for any of you who really want to do computational biology or biological modeling for a living, I would say if you haven't taken a real algorithms class where you spend a term on this kind of thing, that is something I would recommend you do. The more problems like this you're aware of, the more able you are to do the kinds of reasoning we'll be doing shortly. So any questions about any of those problems or any of the kinds of problems we've seen? Okay, then what I want to do then is jump into an example of why I'm trying to tell you about these problems by showing how we would go beyond just recognizing similarities to a problem to actually adapting it to a real-world problem context. And that is to give you an example of a real-world biological problem. And this is kind of illustrative of something I'll try to do a few times as we go through the class. So a lot of times I'm talking about a particular topic like discrete optimization, but I think in many cases for biological modeling, it helps to illustrate these by going through case studies. What I want to do is walk through a very quick kind of mini case study of a particular problem called intraspecies phylogenetics. So intraspecies phylogenetics is the same as regular phylogenetics, so that's another name for evolutionary tree building, except that we assume we're building an evolutionary tree on a set of organisms from a common species. So we might have a little piece of DNA we all have, and we're trying to build the evolutionary tree of those of us in this room for that piece of DNA. And in some sense, that's not so different from any other evolutionary tree problem, but it does have, because of the intraspecies version of this, some additional assumptions we throw onto the problem. One of these is that we're talking about short time scales, which tends to imply that we are not going to have that many mutations. And another of them is that we will very often assume that our ancestor sequences are present in our input sequences. Not all of them, and that'll be an important point, but some of them might be. So it might be that one person's sequence is actually the direct ancestor of another person's sequence. And that's something we wouldn't usually expect if we're doing species evolutionary trees. So, for example, maybe we've got a set of sequences like ACGA, CCGA, CTGA, CTGG, CTAA, that we're assuming are sequences in some piece of conserved genome in all of us, and we might want to construct an evolutionary tree that maybe looks like the following. So this would be one possible answer. Normally we would assume that these are unrooted trees. So that is, we don't assume that there's some particular sequence at the top. It could be any of these sequences. We don't really know which direction things are going. All right, so this then would be the problem we're trying to solve. We're going to assume that we're given some DNA sequences, and we're trying to build an intraspecies phylogeny of those sequences. So I mentioned that one of the first things we often want to do when we try to solve a problem like this is ask us if it reminds us of any problem we already know how to solve. And sometimes that's not entirely straightforward. Sometimes you need to do a bit of abstraction and rearrangement of the problem to try to turn it into something that we know how to solve. And this would be a case where it can be helpful to do a transformation and to recognize that even though our input is a set of strings or sequences here, we're really trying to solve a graph problem. So I'm going to try to rearrange this into a graph problem by saying that let's suppose our input now is a graph. So we've got a set of vertices and a set of edges. And we're going to assume that we have a vertex for each of our input sequences. Let's call that V1, V2, V3, V4, V5. And we're going to assume that our edges will correspond to possible evolutionary relationships, a possible ancestry. And if we want to do that, we're going to want to come up with some model of the evolution that might have occurred between any pair of sequences. And that's where we can start referring to our biology and asking what we know about the biology of this kind of system that might suggest a good model for that. In this case, we've assumed that we're looking at short time scales and therefore that there aren't that many mutations. So we might assume that if we look at two sequences to figure out how one evolved to another, we would say that probably the fewest mutations that allow you to connect one to another would be a model of the evolution that went on between them. So if we're trying to, let's say, connect V1 to V2, we can propose that maybe there is an edge between them, and this edge would correspond to a single mutation, so this flip from A to C here. And we can use that to define a weight function, which we'll call D here, representing an evolutionary distance. And the evolutionary distance would be just the number of bases we need to flip, what's called the Hamming distance, between any two given sequences. And we'll define that to be a function from pairs of vertices to, in this case, integers, so natural numbers, basically. So if we do that, we now have an input graph, and that input graph is going to consist of a set of sequences. I'll just say, take these sequences here. So let's say ACGA, CCGA, CTAA, CTGA, CTGG. For any pair of these, we can come up with a weight between that particular pair of sequences. So we can say there's a weight of 1 between these, a weight of 3 between these, and so forth. And we would then want to define an output. And what we're looking for is an evolutionary tree here. So our output is then we would define to be a tree, T equals V comma E prime, such that E prime is a subset of E. And we'll want to define an objective. And what kind of objectives does our knowledge of our biology imply we should be looking for here? Yeah, so we are going to, if we think based on the biology here that few mutations should have occurred, then we might say that a good objective is going to be to minimize the sum of the weight over edges in E prime, as they call that D. And then what we've ended up with here is a problem we know how to solve, a minimum spanning tree problem. So that would typically be how we would use these kinds of things. We would recognize that by doing the right sort of abstraction, putting this, in this case, into the language of graph theory, we can turn this into a well-defined graph problem. And if we get kind of lucky here and we're willing to tolerate certain abstractions, we can turn it into a graph problem we know how to solve. In practice, though, that's usually just the beginning. Usually these graph problems we know how to solve are not going to be quite the problem we really want to solve, and this is no exception. So typically what you then need to do is start asking, what assumptions have you made about the problem? So what are the ways in which maybe your model of the problem is not really a realistic model of the biology? And there are a lot of those we can come up with. So, for example, one assumption that may be relevant in quite a few real-world contexts is that we have no errors in our data. We would probably come up with a somewhat different model if we assumed that there were sometimes mistakes in our DNA sequences. And if you really work with DNA sequences, you always assume there are mistakes, because there always are mistakes. But we're assuming here there are no mistakes. And that might give us a different problem if we try to allow for the possibility that we might need to correct mistakes. We're assuming a relatively simple cost function. In particular, we're assuming effectively that mutations have equal cost, or equivalently that mutations are equally likely. That's not in general going to be true in biology. Some kinds of mutations occur more easily than others. So just generically, it's easier to flip an A into a G than it is to flip an A into a C or a T. There are other kinds of biases like that. So that's an assumption that's not quite right. We're assuming our output is a tree. So we assume we want a tree. And we're assuming we want really one specific tree, and that's actually hiding quite a lot of assumptions. Some pieces of sequence won't actually have a tree-like history. We may have a piece of sequence where the first half is inherited along one lineage, the second half along another lineage, and they got joined together at some point by recombination. So we're making some unrealistic assumptions here. And we're also assuming no missing data. We're assuming in this minimum spanning tree model that every sequence we need to build our evolutionary tree is present in our original input sequences. And if we're really trying to do modeling, we would typically need to go through these kinds of assumptions and ask what we want to do about each of those particular assumptions. Some of them, we may just decide to live with the assumption. So, for example, no errors. That's a tricky assumption, and actually fixing the algorithm to do error handling may be quite a difficult thing to do. So we may decide that it's just easier to run our twice as many sequences off our sequencer, get rid of our errors that way by just getting more data, getting enough redundancy, and maybe we can convince ourselves that it's actually okay to say there are no errors here. We'll just do enough extra checks. In some cases, it's actually very easy to deal with the problem without really fundamentally changing our model. So let's say we decided that the cost of flipping an A to a G versus an A to a C was different. That it's easier to turn an A into a G, so we'll give that mutation cost 1, but an A to a C is harder, so we'll give that a mutation cost 2, and likewise with all the other ones. We'll come up with different costs for different kinds of mutations. How could we adapt our algorithm to deal with that? Well, there's really nothing we need to do. If you just put in this new distance function, it's still pretty trivial to compute the distance between any two sequences, and we still end up with a minimum spanning tree problem. So the same algorithm will handle it. In other cases, we really need to start digging into the algorithm and doing something a bit more complicated. And one instance where that comes up is in this assumption that we're trying to get a single tree as our answer. So let me take a version of this problem that illustrates why that can be an issue. Let's suppose these were our input sequences, AA, CA, AC, and CC. Then if we construct a minimum spanning tree, this is a minimum spanning tree of those sequences. It has cost 3. But this is also a minimum spanning tree, and it also has cost 3. There are actually 4 of these we can make that have equal cost. Now sometimes that's fine. Maybe the only thing we care about is the cost, and we can say it doesn't matter which of these we have. But often if we're trying to solve a problem like this, we really care about getting the right answer, and we really care about which tree we get. We don't want to tell someone that we think this is the tree if this tree is just as plausible. So that's a case where you really end up having to dig into the algorithm to try to figure out what we can do differently. One possible answer to this is we could say if there are spanning trees. Can anyone figure out what's wrong with that answer? Yeah.
There might be hundreds of those.
Yeah, so in general, the number of optimal solutions could be exponentially large in the size of the problem, exponentially large in the set of sequences we need to consider. You can kind of figure that out by imagining if you build a tree where you sort of have two directions we can pick, and then two more, and then two more, and so forth. You can very quickly get a huge number of equally good solutions. So the way this was actually solved in practice was to do a somewhat more clever solution, which is to say we can't return all of the optimal trees, but you can return something that's almost as good and that you actually can find efficiently, and that is the union of all of the optimal trees. So we can return the thing that looks like this, where we have all four of these edges here, and we can say that every optimal tree is embedded in this one, and that is a way of kind of conveying what the ambiguity is. And it turns out this is something we can solve efficiently, even though we can't efficiently generate all of the individual optimal trees. Now, that is where you have to start digging into the real meat of the algorithm. And for anyone who remembers back to our discussion of Kruskal's algorithm, it turns out that you can actually, with a very minor change to Kruskal's algorithm, get this thing out. So does anyone remember, with respect to Kruskal's algorithm, where the ambiguity in the tree comes into it? So where are we making an arbitrary decision as we go through that process?
You select the edge with the minimum weight. There could be multiple edges with the minimum weight.
Yeah, so when we do that, when we're picking one among potentially several minimum weight edges, that's where we're making one of these arbitrary decisions that fixes you to one solution instead of another. If we just pull off all of those minimum weight edges at once, throw them all into the tree, and then move on from there, then you end up with the algorithm that gives you the union of minimum spanning trees, and that gave a solution to this problem. So that gives us a way of solving this case. And we're left with the one more problem here I mentioned, and that is the lack of a handling of missing data. And to see where that might be an issue, let me just quickly show you one more problem. Let's suppose we have these sequences here. The minimum spanning tree is going to look something like the following. Weight of 2, a weight of 2 for a total weight of 4. And there are 3 possible minimum spanning trees. They all have weight 4. But you can actually do better in this case by constructing the following tree. This is a tree that has weight 1, or weight 3. And we can get it by recognizing that there is a missing sequence that wasn't found in our input. So we would probably want to be able to handle this. This is a case we really care about, where there is a better answer to our problem. And so we might want to go back to Kruskal's algorithm and now say, can we adapt it to solve this version of the problem, to find the minimum tree allowing for these extra nodes we've missed? Can anyone think of a way we could do that? Well, it's kind of a trick question, because the answer is we can't do that. What I've just described here, this problem where we allow for these extra nodes that can fill in these missing pieces, is something called the Steiner tree problem, and that's actually an intractable problem. So there's no way you can adapt, or there's no way anyone knows about, to adapt the Dijkstra algorithm or any other algorithm and get an efficient way of solving this. So to deal with that, sometimes we just have to say that we can deal with a problem we care about. Sometimes we need to go back to the drawing board and find a different sort of model. Or sometimes we need to go to more advanced methods that let us deal with intractable problems like this. And that'll be our subject on next Tuesday. but I think we're out of time here, so I'll just break at this point, and then next Tuesday we'll discuss the issue of how to deal with intractable problems.
Catch you take it home. Yes.